So today we are going to cover some ethics and equity in testing. Now, obviously, I'm not going to be able to cover everything. This is a very broad topic, but I think it's an important one that deserves being discussed early, which is why I put it in the beginning, or early in the class, rather than just diving right into the stats and methods. Because I really think these questions are important. So in terms of our roadmap for this module, first I'm going to talk about the American Psychological Association Code of Conduct. I will then talk about the responsibility of test publishers, as well as user qualifications and professional competence. Afterwards, I will discuss privacy and issues related to that, including communicating test results. Next, I will talk about testing diverse populations and essentially taking into account individual differences. And then I'll wrap with additional lecture on common testing criticisms and which of those are fair, which aren't. So that's the roadmap. And I can see that we can see my mic. Okay. So the American Psychological Association's ethical principles and code of conduct are available online. They provide essentially a huge set of guidelines that professional psychologists ought to and do follow. Section 9, the section we're going to focus on, is dedicated entirely to assessment, and so that's just a small chunk. But it's really important to have these testing standards. We need some guidance here that's in writing, and so I'm going to talk about some of the pieces. So, Section 9. There's tons of chunks. I'm not going to reproduce the whole thing here, but I'm going to give you the highlights. So, psychologists base the opinions contained in their recommendations on information and techniques sufficient to substantiate their findings. So when a psychologist provides their opinion of the psychological characteristics of an individual, they can only do so after they've conducted an examination of that individual. And that examination has to have been adequate to support their statements or conclusions. This is why you will notice that most psychologists won't diagnose a public figure if they haven't treated them specifically. This is called the Goldwater rule. On occasion, some will deviate from this. You don't diagnose public figures unless you're meeting with them. But here's what you're supposed to do. Now, I'm not going to read the rest of these. I'm going to focus on number 2, which is the use of assessments. Because psychologists administer, adapt, score, interpret, and use assessment techniques, as well as interviews, tests, and instruments in a manner and for the purpose that are appropriate in light of research on or evidence of the usefulness or proper application of that technique. So, yeah, now you are only supposed to use assessment instruments whose validity and reliability have been established for use. So you can't try and administer, this is going to be a silly example. You can't give an IQ test to a cat and then and when they can't perform, say this cat has an IQ of 0. That's not fair. So psychologists use these assessments whose validity and reliability have been established for members of the population tested. So you can't use like a child test on adults and expect the results to be meaningful and interpretable. When validity or reliability have not been established, that needs to be really, really well documented in your report. And they have to describe both the strengths and limitations of the test results and interpretation. So noting who it's been established on, how your subject client differs in terms of compared to the reference group. Now, this last one is really, you would think obvious, but it needs to be spelled out. So psychologists use assessment methods that are appropriate to the individual's language. So, and you can't use a test on, like, so I don't know if you can hear this, but Archie has gotten a hold of this. Let's back up. Okay, so psychologists use assessment methods that are appropriate to the language setting. You have to give the test in the language that your client is familiar with. So yeah, psychologists use assessment methods that are appropriate. So don't use an old test. Don't use a test that's wrong language, because these have been issues in the past. Well, that's wrapping up the Code of Conduct for the American Psychological Association. I will see you later. Bye!